The next component we're going to work on is called BaseSelect. This component represents select boxes in our application. Let's switch over to our editor, open up the file with this component, and start assigning types. First of all, as always, we're gonna have to assign attribute called length with the value ts on the script tag. This component contains quite a few properties, specifically 3 properties with names selected, placeholders, and options. So I'm going to cut this declaration from here, put it down here, and comment out for now. So we have a reference while we're gonna be converting this declaration into the new TypeScript declaration while we're gonna assign types for props. So in this case, let's list all these properties in this object, options, selected, as well as placeholder, and now let's assign types one by one to each of those properties. Let's start with the property options. If we take a look at the previous declaration, we can see that for this property we were using validator function called validateSelectOptions that is defined inside of validators.ts file. So in here, as we can see, we reference another function which is called isSelectOptionValid, and if we'll take a look at the definition of this function, we can see in here what validation rules are applied to validate select option. And now we basically have to replicate the same validation rules by using TypeScript notation. As we can see, select option is represented by an object with 2 properties called value and the label. Property value should be numeric or non-empty string, and at the same time property label should be non-empty string. Let's switch over back to BaseSelect component. First of all, I'm going to describe the shape of select option element. It should be an object with property value that should be either number or a string, and it should also contain property label, which will be a string. Since options property should be an array of such option objects, we're going to use square brackets right here. With the other properties, situation is much easier, so for the selected property I'm going to use a union of 3 types: number, string, and null. And for the property placeholder, we're going to use a string type. Just like we were doing before, for the selected property we were using 2 types, and for the placeholder property we were using only 1 type, but using different notation. And now we can easily remove all these commented code, as well as all unused imports in this component. And after this, we can actually remove some of the validation functions that are no longer used. So let's switch over to validators.ts. First of all, let's remove validateSelectOptions functions since it is no longer used. And as for this function isSelectValueValid, this function is currently used to validate event payload of the BaseSelect component. We're going to come back to typing event payload a little bit later in this lesson, but for now we can just remove this function because we're not gonna need it anymore as well. And there are also a couple more unused functions. Those are isNumber or null. Let's get rid of this function, as well as isSelectOptionValid. Let's remove this one as well. And now we're going back to BaseSelect component and start assigning type for the event. This component fires only one event with the name select, so I'm going to extract this event declaration from here and use it as a reference while we're gonna be using TypeScript notation to properly type event as well as its payload. And the way we're assigning types to events is pretty much the same as for properties, but the notation will be a little bit different. So right here, inside this object notation, we're going to use brackets, and inside these brackets, we have to use key value pairs. There is a special key called E, which will represent the name of the event, which will be fired by this component. As we can see, the event name in our case is select. Then we also have to specify type of the payload of this event, which is going to be sent over once we're gonna fire this event to parent component. And in this case, type of the payload will be a union of 3 types: number, string, and null. And eventually, the function emit, which will be used to fire these events, will not return anything, so we're going to use type void. And now if we're going to try to fire any other event, which is not equal to select, we're going to see that TypeScript complains about it because this component is only able to fire only one event with a name called select, just like we have specified in here. And the payload of this event should be either number, string, or null. And if we'll try to assign another payload type, TypeScript is also going to complain about this. In addition to that, if we'll try to use function emit, we're gonna get helpful autocomplete with the list of all available events to us. So this way, we'll not fire invalid event by mistake. But actually, in more recent versions of Vue, we got another more concise syntax to describe events. So now let's comment out this line and use new syntax to describe an event. And if we'll use this new syntax, we have to use key value pairs. So the key should correspond to the event name we're gonna be firing. In our case, it is select. And as a value, we're going to specify another TypeScript type called tuple. Here we're also going to use a key, which will be the name of our payload. And as a value for this key, we have to specify payload type. So in our case, it will be a union of three these types. So after describing the event by using the new syntax, let's also ensure that by specifying invalid event name, we're gonna get an error, as well as if we're going to specify invalid type for the payload of the event, we're also going to get red squiggly line. So everything's working good here. From now on, we're going to use the new syntax of defining events. So let's assign explicit type to the return value of the closure that we are passing inside computed function. In this case, the type will be Boolean. Then let's also specify the correct type for the parameter of the function called select. In here, it will be either string or null. And because this function does not return any value, we're going to use void type as the return type. But if we'll scroll down to the template, we can actually see that TypeScript complains about usage of this target property, because TypeScript doesn't know that this target property will store a reference to the select HTML element. Because to TypeScript, this target property can actually reference any HTML element, and even that HTML element that might not contain property value, and that is why this usage is highlighted. And to actually give TypeScript a hint and tell that target element will actually reference HTML select element, we're going to use typecasting and cast this expression to proper type. It will be HTML select element, like this. And now TypeScript knows that the target property will refer to select element which has property called value. And now TypeScript stops complaining. So eventually we're going to remove all unused imports in this component. And at this point, we were able to properly assign types to props of these components, as well as all events that this component can fire. Everything seems to be okay in this file, but if we'll actually open up activity item component, we will see that TypeScript highlights one place in this file, which is related to seconds to complete property. And this is happening because seconds to complete property can only accept values of either type number or undefined. But the payload which is coming from the BaseSelect component along with event called select, this payload is stored inside special variable called $event, and this payload is of type string, number, or null. So here we have type mismatch. That is why TypeScript doesn't like this assignment. For the time being, I'm going to avoid this error by actually casting this variable to any type, and in the future lessons we're going to find the proper fix to this. And by the way, applying casting to any type of this expression is no longer needed, because in this lesson we have already typed property called selected, which is either string, number, or null. So TypeScript knows for sure what this property type should be, so we don't need to cast anything here anymore. If we'll take a look at the definition of props inside BaseSelect component right here, we can actually see that we have explicitly assigned type for the selected prop. And the type of that expression that we were assigning to this selected prop can either be number or null, which is compatible with selected property declaration. So now we have successfully finished conversion of another view component. Link to the source code of this project will be in the video description.